Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 8th of February 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, and myself, Brian Gerrish. We're also joined by David Scott. David, of course, reporting from north of the border with northern exposure. But our illustrious Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed. Of course, only 50 days remaining before we're supposedly leaving the European Union. So she was in Brussels yesterday trying to deal with this issue of the backstop. Isn't it impressive? Well, was it impressive, Brian? She came out after the meeting with, giving a statement to the press. And I thought it would be worthwhile just to have a look at that. I'm not really so much concentrating on what she's saying, more how she's saying it.
Well, I've had a good series of meetings today. We've had robust discussions, but they've been constructive. What I've set out is our clear position that we must secure legally binding changes to the withdrawal agreement to deal with the concerns that Parliament has over the backstop. And taking that changes to the backstop together with the other work that we're doing on workers' rights and other issues will deliver a stable majority in Parliament, and that's what I will continue to push for. Now, it's not going to be easy, but crucially President Juncker and I have agreed that talks will now start to find a way through this, to find a way to get this over the line and to deliver on the concerns that Parliament has, so we get a majority in Parliament. Well, I've set out very clearly the position from Parliament that we must have legally binding changes to the withdrawal agreement in order to deal with Parliament's concerns over the backstop. What I see and hear from leaders is a desire for us to work together to ensure that we can deliver the UK leaving the European Union with a deal. My work is to deliver Brexit, to deliver it on time, and I'm going to be negotiating hard in the coming days to do just that.
So, Brian, I don't know what you thought about that, but it seemed to me that as soon as she mentioned the word Juncker, she had been delivering that message quite clearly up to that point. As soon as she said the word Juncker, it's all started to fall apart. The hesitation came in. She was there was a warble in her voice, and then later on, towards the end of that, as soon as she was starting to say what she was going to actually deliver, again, the sort of nervous tick came in, and she was she's clearly demonstrating that she's under pressure, in my opinion.
Huge pressure, Mike, and I hope people will go and have a look at that clip, and you need to see it quite close up. But when she mentions Juncker and she starts juddering a bit, it's her left eye, you can also see, is glistening. There is something very strange taking place. I think she's heavily reframed, Mike. She's not giving any of her own opinions. This is simply what's been drilled into her head by the media team. You must say this and this and this in front of the cameras to stay online, and she's got all of that in her head. She's got the pressure of the situation. She's not really up to the job, and we are starting to, I think she's getting very close to breakdown. Actually, that's my opinion. David.
Yeah, David, welcome to the programme. I mean, it struck me once again that we're starting to see similar types of behaviour from Theresa May that we perhaps saw from Hillary Clinton in 2016.
Yeah, not as bad, but yeah, I see what you mean. I also noticed in that last piece, when she said the words stable majority in Parliament, the voice went a little squeak.
Yes.
And I think that's showing some tension as well.
Yeah. I'm just going to add, and it's probably going to be picked up for this comment, that I think it would have been better if she'd left her jacket unbuttoned as she got out of the car, a little bit tight, pulling there, and the trousers maybe just a little bit too short, but that's only my personal opinion. Now, we need to come on to Steve Baker MP, because Steve Baker has really given us the picture. This is what he said in front of a committee recently. Now, I've taken this from a Russia Today clip because I'm not seeing it in our illustrious UK mainstream media. Maybe it is, I didn't see it, but this is what he said. The constant refrain throughout my time in government, and he's speaking as the former Brexit minister, the constant refrain throughout my time in government was this atmosphere of reluctance to leave. And I think this is at the heart of the problem. While we won the vote, we did not win the argument in, for want of a better term, within the governing class. Now that is one amazing statement, but he went on, he said this: so we've ended up with those that govern being forced to do that which they must, take us out, but it is not that which they choose. And that suffuses the entire approach. The entire approach is suffused by a reluctance to deliver what the public wanted, which is us controlling our laws in our parliament with all that means. I think this is a really amazing statement because it is so accurate. It's taken Russia Today to tell us what's really happening in Parliament. David, it couldn't be clearer. The public have said what they want. Westminster and the MPs and the government know what the public want, but the government is doing everything they can to stall, lie and deceive this Brexit process.
And during this, I think what's meant to have happened is the public have meant to have changed their minds. Now, that's not happening. And the next item is an example of maybe where the European culture and British culture are rather different. That the British don't like being pushed around, don't like being told what to do, and don't like being bullied. Enter Donald Tusk.
Yeah, Donald Tusk saying, I've been wondering what that special place in hell looks like for those who promoted Brexit without even a sketch of a plan how to carry it out safely. Now, of course, everybody will have heard that this is what he said. And as you've pointed out here in The Guardian, and the bit of Theresa May's comments that we showed a little bit at the beginning of the programme that The Guardian chose to focus on was her response to what Donald Tusk had said. That it was not helpful, that it was causing dismay. But the cartoonists have been at their work, David.
Yes. Yeah, here you see the dismay, right? Are these comments causing dismay? No, they're not causing dismay. They're causing anger. They're causing resentment. They're causing a view in Britain. So, okay, if that's the way you're going to be, we're off, right? And you're seeing even quite numbers of people who voted to remain have had enough of this, because what Brexit has done, and Brexit is a thing that I dearly love, and it's a gift it keeps on giving, despite all of the lies and half-truths about it. Because what it's done is it's revealed a great deal about other institutions. It's revealed to the British public the nature of the EU in ways we didn't see as clearly before. It's revealed a good number of things about Scottish politics. It's revealed a lot of things which were hidden. And one of these is the bullying nature of the EU. Now, the Donald Tusk comment, a couple of points about that. He was talking about the need for a plan. What these people are afraid of is a society without a plan. That is a society of liberty, where there are, in Britain's case, 60 million plans, not one central one. And there's been 15,000 responses to his tweet. The one I liked most was from Yanis Varoufakis from Greece. And he said to Donald Tusk, probably very similar to the place reserved for those who designed a monetary union without a proper banking union, and once the banking crisis hit, transferred cynically the bankers' gigantic losses onto the shoulders of the weakest taxpayers. That's quite well said.
Well, indeed, and it sort of reflects this cartoon from Bob, which shows the devil taking Mr. Tusk down into hell and saying, "Don't worry, Mr. Tusk, our deepest, foulest pit is reserved for smug little hypocrites." So you know, the commentary has been quite disdainful. We wait to see what goes on. 50 days remaining. 14th of February next week is the next Brexit debate in the Commons, where basically nothing much is going to happen because it's just a general debate. There may be some amendments which attempt to push the 29th of March deadline out, but other than that, not much going on. But also on the 14th of February, there's a deadline for statutory instruments for getting a lot of the secondary legislation that was brought about as a result of the EU withdrawal bill onto the statute books. And apparently, that deadline is fast approaching next week, and I don't see too much movement on this. I mean, David, normally statutory instruments, so-called secondary legislation, get laid before Parliament in front of an empty chamber, and then they sit there for 40 days waiting for somebody to object to them, and it never really happens. In the case of Brexit, you might expect there to be a bit more scrutiny about what's going on, but maybe in the light of all the sort of recent shenanigans, the EU withdrawal bill and the implications of the entire body of EU legislation coming onto the British statute books has sort of fallen off the discussion topic. It's fallen under the radar.
Yes, and I think shenanigans are more likely than scrutiny. Are one of the factions, one of the many factions within Parliament, going to use this as an opportunity for further delay, further confusion, further chaos? We'll see.
Okay, let's move on then. And well, here's an interesting little report that has appeared, and thanks very much to Paul Bridger for the tip-off on this one. So this is a report that was launched on Tuesday evening from the Society of Conservative Lawyers, and it's calling for an end to the convention created by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown that military action should only be carried out with the pre-approval of Parliament. Well, in fact, they argue that there's no such convention in the first place. So the title is An Executive Decision. Prior parliamentary approval is not and should not be required for the government to deploy the armed forces in a conflict situation. And the foreword is by Nick Houghton, General the Lord Houghton of Richmond, former Chief of the Defence Staff. And he has this to say: in 2011, the coalition administration suggested that a constitutional convention had emerged, that the government should seek parliamentary approval before deploying the armed forces on a conflict footing. A subsequent government motion on military action in Syria in 2013 was defeated in the House of Commons by 13 votes. The proposed operation was duly cancelled. Some commentators have since suggested that any future significant deployment of the armed forces would now be impossible without recourse to Parliament. This has caused unease within military ranks. Successful military operational activity, particularly at its outset, relies on secrecy, security, and surprise. Greater parliamentary involvement could easily undermine the UK's military operational effectiveness. It is therefore both refreshing and reassuring to read this paper. So who wrote it? Well, these MPs are all also barristers. So we've got Sir Oliver Heald, QC, Victoria Prentice, Sir Henry Bellingham, Bob Neal, Sir Christopher Chope, and Robert Courts. And these are the main points that they are highlighting here. First of all, the power to deploy UK armed forces in situations of armed conflict lies with the royal prerogative. And they're saying the conventions cannot be spoken into being, constitutional conventions that is, cannot be spoken into being. To exist, a convention requires a political practice to become as so entrenched over a sustained period of time that to deviate from it, from that practice would be constitutionally unacceptable. This has not happened. They say the absence of such a convention is both sensible and desirable. And they're saying that Parliament exists to hold the government to account, not to make the decisions of the executive. If Parliament were to approve military action that subsequently proved controversial, then ministers could avoid accountability by shifting the blame onto MPs. Well, Parliament exists to hold government to account, but in this context, it's not clear how they would do that, but we can talk about that in a second. They go on to say a convention would limit the UK Armed Forces operational effectiveness in situations where the priority is to strike without warning. And they say it's hard to imagine a situation where military force would be deployed not in response to a threat to a national interest or to prevent a humanitarian disaster. I think we could very much debate that point. We go on. Requiring a parliamentary vote also raises the spectre of the government being defeated and politically unable to fulfil the UK's international treaty obligations. And the power to deploy military force in a conflict situation should remain with the prerogative. Therefore, and they go on to say conflict deployment itself should be made by the Prime Minister in Cabinet, advised by our National Security Council and briefed by our intelligence and military services. And so what I'm interested to get your thoughts on, Brian, first is constitutionally, of course, what they're saying is absolutely correct. There is no such constitutional convention. Tony Blair was forced to sort of move in that direction because unfortunately Britain had got involved in a war which was technically illegal, and therefore he received a significant amount of criticism for using the royal prerogative in the way that he did, despite the fact that a couple of million people were out in the streets to tell him that they did not want him to take that action. So while they're constitutionally their points are reasonable, Morally, their points once again probably aren't. And so, how do we hold the executive to account if the executive has the sole prerogative to decide when and where we go to war?
A lot there, Mike.
Yeah.
I think I'd just like to start by coming back to Steve Baker. I'm going to comment more than answer what you put there. Steve Baker warning us that we've got a government which doesn't want to do what the people require. That is the mindset he's describing accurately. So if they're prepared to lie and deceive over Brexit, they're prepared to lie and deceive over going to war. And we need to be very careful what our government does. And maybe that debate in Westminster would give a check on that. But isn't it interesting that at the very time when the government is running roughshod over the Constitution with regard to Brexit, suddenly we're desperately concerned that we can't just use the military when and where we want to? Why has this suddenly come up? What are they planning? And I'm very suspicious. I'm also suspicious when they say here that the military are very concerned because they need the secrecy of strike. This doesn't ring true with me. The military are going to be saying the last thing we want to do is actually go and have people killed in the field. So I think this is a totally political agenda, and they are worried because they think they're getting to the point where the public is curtailing their use of force. That's my view.
I agree with that, David. I also suspect that in terms of the timing of this, I find it interesting that once again we've got another document discussing constitutional issues. But the timing of this is interesting in the sense that the issue of EU defence union is suddenly getting a much broader exposure with the public, and perhaps they're concerned about whether the Parliament may prevent the government from involving themselves in that type of treaty.
And yes, the very fact that you're having this debate and discussion is showing the effect of Blair on this country, because it's all relating to the lack of trust that we now have in our leadership. And that's a lack of trust on matters which are international and involve bloodshed that I don't think was true before the Iraq War. And something very fundamentally changed there. And I don't think it's coming back. I don't think any of the subsequent leaders have actually restored any confidence on the part of the people that we will not be signed up for reasons unknown into foreign adventures that are not in our national interest.
Yes, good points. Okay, where do we go then?
Well, I think we head straight to this article because it's funny as we're talking about the government's ability to get troops in action without any debate in Westminster. We've got the BBC coming up with this little story, the weapons making nuclear war more likely. Now, I read through this. There's quite a lot of statistics in it about nuclear weapons. It was very interesting to see in one of their diagrams that they're freely admitting that Israel, amongst other countries, but Israel now has apparently 80 deployable nuclear weapons. That's according to this BBC article. But the whole article was about we're heading into greater danger with nuclear war because of vehicles which can be used to deliver nuclear weapons. And then as you weave your way through the story, you find that they're pointing a finger, of course, at Russia, because those nasty Russians have pulled out of agreements. Well, they have, following the Americans simply refusing to adhere to treaty requirements. So it's a very well-crafted article, and it's very interesting how this thing has been put together. But if we say, well, back in the Cold War, of course, that tactical nuclear weapons could be deployed with shells out of guns, what is the big scare with this article? I think this is created. And this is where it gets interesting, because at the end it says this analysis piece was commissioned by the BBC from an expert working for an outside organisation. James Acton is co-director of the Nuclear Policy Programme at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. This article is based on the escalation through entanglement, how the vulnerability of command and control systems raises the risk of an inadvertent nuclear war. And you can follow him here. So we've also got the BBC editor, Duncan Walker. But this is the bit that interests me. Who exactly is James Acton, and why should we believe what he has to say on this situation? Well, if we come in, let's have a look, because the BBC link takes you through to this page, which is the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And we can now see a little bit more about this man. So he holds the Jessica T. Matthews Chair and is co-director of Nuclear Policy Programme at Carnegie. A physicist by training. I think he was at Cambridge originally. He's written a lot of paperwork. We're to trust this man, but he's got some other interests. He's a member of the Nuclear Security Working Group and of the Advisory Council for the Luxembourg Forum on Preventing Nuclear Catastrophe. So it's now becoming a little bit murky actually what this man really is. It's not simply the case that he's an independent observer. So is Carnegie independent? Well, here we are, a new strategy for a new age, and they are apparently working to advance international peace. Who have we got? Well, if we have a look at this list, and as always, we encourage the public to have a look at this to see for themselves. We've got a mixture of very, very powerful people, many of them connected with hedge funds and the banking industry. That's the first thing that you see. We've then also got former politicians. We've got former people linked through to commerce and other trusts and things. So is this an independent group of people? There are so many people here with so many interests, it's almost hard to see. But if we get in a little bit deeper, there's a sort of pattern that comes. So we've got I think these are two new trust members. Robert Zoellick was president of the World Bank from 2007 to 2012. Served as US trade representative, then part of the Bush administration. Now he's in a hedge fund. We've got Jonathan Oppenheimer, South African businessman, began his career NM Rothschild and Sons and De Beers. So immensely powerful people. It's a little bit more than the BBC would have us know. What about the other organisation that this guy is involved with, the Nuclear Security Working Group? Well, here it is. They're working to make us safer with pressing nuclear issues. Again, if we go and have a look at these people, we're going to see we've got a similar mix of high-profile people. We've got Ambassador Susan Burke, former special representative to the President of the United States for nuclear non-proliferation. We've got an ambassador. We've got the American Middle East Institute, the Crockett Policy Institute, the Honourable Elbridge Colby, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defence for Strategy and Force Development, the Department of Defence. So none of these people, in my mind, are truly independent. And does that mean that the BBC article is tainted? Well, here's the Luxembourg Forum. What have they got to say for themselves? Well, they're facilitating the process of arms limitation and reduction of nuclear weapons. So they've got an agenda. People are going to have to look at this themselves. Again, a huge mix of powerful banking interests with political people and trusts and forums and organisations. Clearly, there must be some agenda running through this. But what astonished me when I got into this one was these people are all Russians. And this is quite extraordinary because we've got a PhD, Major General, retired, Russia, Dvorkin. We've got Arbatov, we've got Aznobishchev, we've got Russians, and at the moment we're told that we should be highly suspicious of anybody who's Russian, so clearly that's not true. Then we come into this gentleman who's the president of the Luxembourg Forum, and he is a very powerful man. He is president of the International Luxembourg Forum. He's part of the European Council on Tolerance and Reconciliation, president of the European Jewish Congress, chair of the World Jewish Congress, World Holocaust Forum, European Jewish Fund, and he's also says he's working alongside in one of the organisations with Tony Blair himself. And if you look at this man's background, he's also Russian, born in Moscow, huge numbers of orders. I find this very difficult to explain. I've got a little bit more to say on this, but David, you go into a BBC article, you find that the subject is being dealt with, I would say, in a very biased way. You try and pin down where this has come from, and you're all of a sudden into what I would loosely call a snake's wedding of people, interests, big business, banking. How does this work?
Well, this is a deep state, isn't it? It's a deep state in action. And what is the information that the BBC are trying to put forward? Is it fake news? Are they trying to suggest that we're in very dangerous times and we have to watch those pesky Russians because there's never been a time quite like it? You mentioned the Crockett Foundation. Well, that's a name that rings a bell, because if you go back to 1950s and look up an American weapon system called the Davy Crockett, it was a micronuclear device fired from a recoilless rifle by an infantry soldier, and it had a yield of between 10 and 20 tons, very small, and that's 1950s technology. This is not new.
No, this is not new. We're going to say this is a spun article. What I couldn't find was any detail of the BBC expert Duncan Walker. We just bring up a picture of him. This is the only picture we were able to find from his Twitter page. So we've got a man who says that, what does he say? He says he's looking after expert analysis for BBC News. He's got 2 small boys and a couple of bikes, and the views are more or less his. And all we've got of this man is a cartoon picture of a cat. I think it's a cat. This is outrageous, David, that we have got this organisation swallowing 3.74 billion of public money, and they are producing this utter rubbish, including cartoon pictures of their own staff.
Yes, but the thing that's most striking about the BBC coverage of late is the lack of news. I mean, I think eventually boredom is going to kill them as much as anything, because it's not, at least the Guardian's completely mental. It's at least entertaining. The BBC doesn't even have that.
Indeed. Okay, now, quick reminder that if you like what we do here at the UK Column and you'd like to support us, please do so. You can join ukcolumn.org/community. You can join us there. And a reminder that AV 9.1 DVDs are available on the UK Column website as well. Presentations from Brian, Alex Thompson, Patrick Henningsen, Dr. Graham Downing, and Ian R. Crane.
Okay, and also this one on February the 22nd in the evening, Buckfastleigh, Devon. There's a very good talk on 5G, smart meter technology, and the impact on our health. So help promulgate that one if you can, please.
Okay, so we published an article last night, Beyond Integrity Initiative, the scale of UK government counter disinformation. And really what we're looking at here is if Integrity Initiative and the Institute for Statecraft have been promoting or trying to deal with so-called disinformation from overseas, then what's the situation as far as the British government is concerned? Domestically, at least the Institute for Statecraft falls under the Foreign Commonwealth Office for money. So what's happening domestically? And of course, we're talking about the recently established, or at least 10 months or so ago, established Rapid Reaction Unit within the Cabinet Office. We're asking, could that be linked to the Rapid Reaction Mechanism for the G7? Are they feeding information into that? And we're looking at the contract for government advertising, which seems to be in the region of £800 million to cover 2018 and 2020. So, that is an interesting article. Please get that out as far and wide as you possibly can. But David, the Europeans have been issuing their own information with regard to so-called disinformation.
Yes, indeed. Here we have the European Commission High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, and he has a plan. He has an action plan against. Oh, beg your pardon.
It doesn't really matter anymore.
has an action plan against disinformation. Now, here's the basic statement is disinformation undermines the trust of citizens in democracy and democratic institutions. Disinformation also contributes to the polarization of public views and interferes in the democratic decision-making processes, and it can be used to undermine the European project. So if you understand that disinformation really means a free exchange of views without it being controlled by the state, then that undermines the EU and indeed the whole democratic decision-making process, because ultimately they cannot defend what they're doing.
Absolutely. Now you've, excuse me, a couple of screenshots here with the various actions.
So so just quickly running through this. So action 1, they're going to strengthen the strategic communication task forces and union forces, plural, and union delegations with additional staff and new tools to detect, analyze, and expose disinformation activities. Member states should, where appropriate, also upgrade their national capacity, integrity initiative being an exemplar, I'm sure, and support the necessary increase in resources. We've got lots of those for the strategic communication task forces and union delegation. Now, a couple of quick things. It's task forces plural. So this is the East, the Balkans, and the South. We have a specific Arab direction to the strategic communications. And the other thing is this idea of strategic communication. This means communication used with an agenda, with a plan. So it's admitting,
propaganda then?
It's admitting it. Yes, the very name strategic communication carries within it the idea of propaganda. It's just being rebadged.
Yes. Okay. And so by March 2019, the Commission and High Representative, in cooperation with Member States, will establish a rapid alert system. That sounds very similar to the rapid response unit for addressing disinformation campaigns, working closely with existing networks, the European Parliament, as well as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the G7's rapid response mechanism. So we've got this all fully integrated. We've got the international stuff coming from Britain via the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Andy Price's Counter Disinformation and Media Development Programme. We've got the domestic in the Cabinet Office. We've now got the EU level. This is they're building the biggest propaganda network they can.
They certainly are. NATO's involved, America's involved, Britain's most certainly involved, and yes, it's all being carefully coordinated, but it seems to be centred on Europe. And they're also very interested in communication efforts based on us. We're going to communicate the union values and policies. Member states should significantly strengthen their own communication efforts on union values. I'm not absolutely clear what union values are. I do know that honouring referenda is not amongst them. Just ask the Irish or indeed the Danes. But I'm not quite sure what they are.
Okay, well, let's come on to this then, if we're sticking with disinformation. And this is Sputnik, and their headline is How Integrity Initiative's Counterfeit Expert Perpetuated the Novichok Narrative. Now, I recommend people go and read this. This is an article by Kit Klarenberg, and it says, it starts by saying, by 7th of March, it had been established the Skripals was struck by a nerve agent. Confirmation merely triggering yet another further frenzied theorizing, much of it unscientific, on what precise variety had struck the pair. Could it have been VX, for instance, first synthesized in the 1950s at Porton Down, the UK's secretive and controversial chemical and biological weapons testing centre situated a mere 8 kilometres from Salisbury? A day later, security consultant Dan Kajeta offered an alternative explanation, writing for controversial website Bellingcat. He suggested the agent may have been Novichok. The Soviet Union, he is quoted as saying, the Soviet Union developed a new series of nerve agents in the 1970s and 1980s. The exact nature of these so-called Novichok agents is still debated, and the information on them varies a bit depending on what source you're looking at. Some Novichok agents of interest include A230 and A232, is what Kajeta said for Bellingcat. And Kit Klarenberg went on to say it is seemingly the first time anyone anywhere had connected the substance with the Salisbury incident. but it would soon become a crucial feature in the UK government's official narrative. And he then goes on to establish that Gazzetta was working for Integrity Initiative. So this is an interesting article. There's a lot of detail in it, but as you would imagine, it has created quite a furore on Twitter, particularly with Dan Gazzetta himself. So he tweeted out, "I will continue to work for Integrity Initiative as needed. If that makes you angry, that's your problem and not mine." So he was being quite bullish about it, yes. And he went on to say, "Needless to say, don't believe anything that Sputnik, wholly state-owned propaganda wing of the Russian state, says about me. Bunch of gits. Maybe they hate me for speaking the truth, or is it my Lithuanian surname?" So he's being quite aggressive about this, but equally others are weighing in his defense. For example, this from Defending Democracy, and they pushed out this little infographic here, "Conspiracy in pro-Kremlin media." And apparently anybody that's talking about the Rothschilds, reptilians, climate hoax, AIDS hoax, shadow world government, the Elders of Zion, secret experiments, these people are all, despite the fact that this stuff has been discussed for 50 years, David, these people are all pro-Kremlin media. So, so how do you feel about that?
Well, I'm struck by the fact that these people have no argument, because what's the journalist's response to Sputnik? Right? It's to say you're a racist. It's not to actually refute any part of their argument. It's not to argue the facts of the case. There is no mature democratic discussion of the issues, right? There can only be one story, and if you don't tell the approved story, you'll be called a racist, you'll be shut down by regulatory means or other. And that's it. There can only be one understanding of anything these days. And the reason that Russia today and Sputnik and people like this are being hated is they are bursting that bubble.
Well, indeed, but it gets better, because with this article being published, we've now got a whole raft of articles about the Salisbury attack in the press today. So the Independent, Salisbury attack, third Novichok suspect linked to 2015 poisoning in Bulgaria. And surprise, surprise, the source for this article is Bellingcat. So apparently there's a third Novichok suspect, and apparently this third suspect, who is potentially at large still in the UK, was linked to the 2015 poisoning in Bulgaria. But it gets better, because now there are 5 suspects, according to the Daily Mail. So 5 Russians wanted over the Salisbury poisoning, but apparently the other 2 have already left the country, or they left the country at the time. So there's apparently only one that is possibly still at large in the UK. So it comes back to the question is, who is pushing disinformation here? And I think the Western media is quite capable of carrying that label. But let's continue with more disinformation. Because here's Dame Sally Davies, the Chief Medical Officer, because she has now been promoted, having dealt with the Skripal incident quite so well.
With baby wipes.
Well, we're coming on to that. So she said today on the Radio 4 Today programme, "It has been an honour to be the first female Chief Medical Officer. I'm delighted to be appointed as Master of Trinity College, following a distinguished list of predecessors, and as the first woman to be so." So she's really pleased to be the first woman as Chief Medical Officer and the first woman Master of Trinity College. But let's just remember what her input to the Skripal affair was, and that was that her advice for any individual: wash your clothes and wipe down any personal items, shoes and bags, with cleansing or baby wipes before disposing of them in the usual way. So that was one of the more egregious pieces of disinformation, in my opinion, and that's why I'm including her in this section. But just to end this section on disinformation, a few weeks ago, if you remember, we highlighted this article in Devon Live, which was all about speed cameras, everything we knew about the new yellow Vulture speed cameras now installed in Devon. And what Devon Live was claiming was that souped up speed cameras so powerful they will catch you tucking into a sandwich behind the wheel have arrived in Devon. Traditionally, traffic cameras will only detect speeding, but these new yellow vultures will know if you're not wearing a seatbelt, using your phone, eating, drinking, or smoking. That's because they feature new LED infrared tech and face oncoming traffic. You'll be forgiven for not realizing they're cameras at all because they look completely different. So this was the story in Devon Live. And when this story came out, or when this story was brought to my attention, I had a look around at other local media, and the same story was seemed to be published in other local media around the country. So if you remember, we said that Pippa King had long-standing campaigner on the issue of privacy and so on, had put a freedom of information request into Devon Cornwall Police about this, and she received the response yesterday. Dear Miss King, this is to inform you that I cannot identify any specific records or documents held by the Devon and Cornwall Police that will satisfy your request based on the details you've provided. They went on to say the Safety Camera Partnership have confirmed that the cameras on the A380 is only an average speed system. The camera units were replaced with new units as the old ones were no longer serviceable. The understanding of the Safety Camera Partnership is that the story came to media attention because the camera housing is a different shape. This included the cameras themselves, and the separate infrared illuminators are for nighttime images. In other words, David, this was a complete piece of fabricated fake news that went around, okay, in local press, but nonetheless, I'm almost speechless, really, because when we have so many examples now of mainstream media making stories up, and yet it's not them that are on the receiving end of this disinformation campaign from the government and from the social media companies. It's the likes of the UK column, 21st Century Wire, and Vanessa Beeley, and so on. So, you know, at what point are the public going to start really calling time on this?
Yes, because what matters is not the accuracy, as is clear. What matters is the message. So if the message is critical of vested interests, then it will be targeted. If the message is perhaps that you should be afraid of your government and you must comply with all commands, then the fact that it's not actually true isn't so important. So it seems to be very politically led. What's that called? Post-truth?
Yes.
Post-truth, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, now a few days ago on this programme we mentioned that the Equality and Human Rights Commission had published some guidance for universities on the issue of freedom of expression and free speech, including a helpful chart for them to, yes, flow diagram, thank you, I'm struggling today, flow diagram for anybody wanting to hold an event in a university so they could make sure that they could decide, make a proper decision and record their decisions properly when they were deciding who they were going to host at some kind of event at a university. Well, David, it seems that, well, one person, Peter Hitchens, is certainly not welcome.
No, he's not, or rather, he's not welcome this month because this is LGBT History Month and a celebration of all things LGBT, and anybody who doesn't agree, I don't even think he was coming to talk about that, but anyone who doesn't agree or has any history of taking a different view is no longer welcome. So he was uninvited.
So what he said here is that is thought policing and it's undoubtedly censorship. There's no way out of it. There's a group of people who don't want my views to be heard because they've been taught for many years in schools what to think rather than how to think, and they're afraid of opposing opinions, so they want to silence them. It's quite interesting that the guidance that universities have been given makes it quite clear that you should not be afraid of opposing views and opposing opinions, and you should be encouraging them. And yet this doesn't seem to be what is actually happening on the ground. Again, Spiked covered this as well. The ugly truth is that student unions, contrary to their cries of innocence, have become Stalinist creatures intent on curtailing free speech, rather than creating an environment that empowers students to challenge views they disagree with. Student unions instead promote a sense of victimhood and encourage students to wallow in self-pitying righteousness.
And anyone, this article was a student to put on an event with Mr. Hitchens, which he had to put on separately from the Students' Union because he could not get support for it because Mr. Hitchens' views were not allowed. And what he was faced with was a demand for risk assessments and safe spaces and a trigger warning before a 5-minute long trigger warning before the event, and all of these little bureaucratic issues which just made the thing completely unviable. So he had to put it on such a small budget that I think he ended up sleeping on the floor while Peter Hitchens had his bed. So there you go. What you've got to do.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if that's an indication of where we're headed, utter censorship, have a look at this lovely quote by the Minister for Injustice. We are emphasising the need for new technologies and new ideas to catch people early before their problems escalate to the courtroom. Now, that's quite a statement. What was she talking about? She was talking about plans to get legal advice into GP surgeries, so that people who've got problems with housing or whatever, and this could affect their mental health, all of that can be nipped in the bud. So we're now going to use the legal teams to help people who are suffering at the hands of the state. Or is this getting legal teams into the surgery so they can nip anybody who's likely to be a troublemaker early in the bud? Pretty Soviet stuff there, David, and I hope people are really going to pay attention to the sorts of language being used, because it is Soviet.
It is, and this is, of course, the Scottish model of government, or SMOG. This is joined up government. There are no separations between any departments. If you speak to the state, you speak to all of it. And that includes, if you have a housing problem, you could be speaking, your information could be shared with mental health. It could be shared with police. Anybody. It could be shared with anybody. There are no limits. I think data rape was the phrase that was used in Parliament at one point as someone was opposing this. That's what's going on.
Okay. That's it. Thank you for joining us today. That's the end of today's news. As always, if you're not a subscriber of UK Column, please consider taking out a subscription and or making a donation. We need your financial support to continue doing what we're doing, particularly as the UK government ramps up its attack on free speech. We'll be back on Monday. Bye-bye.